if we're talking about the EBU membership, of course, I said it yesterday, it's 41 members. And if we're talking about just the European Union for a moment, it's still 27 different countries. And therefore, different countries meaning different political and electoral systems with all different legislation covering them and also having different provisions for people with disabilities. Now, despite this complexity, I think there are still a number of trends, at least, that I can try to highlight. There will always be exceptions in many countries, but there are a few trends I would like to share with you. Maybe starting by one comment about the so-called European elections, or more correctly, elections to the European Parliament, taking place next year, by the way. Even they are, as such, in legislative terms, 27 national elections taking place within and on the same dates, let's say, and to allocate by country seats to the European Parliament. So there is some framing legislation for the so-called European elections, but even in terms of organizational and logistical terms, how persons with disabilities can cast their vote in secret in the country of their residence is still varying from one place to the other, even under the umbrella of the so-called European elections. So there are no easy answers there either, I'm afraid to say. Now, coming to the trends that I mentioned. I think there are three general forms of voting that we should distinguish. There is, of course, the paper-based, traditional, if you'd like, voting method. There is the electronic voting, and there is online voting. And I insist a little bit on the distinction between e-voting and online voting. Because e-voting often refers just to the fact that you go still to your polling station and you insert an electronic card into a voting machine, which then opens the menu where you can choose the different parties or candidates and so on. And this raises, in terms of accessibility, very different issues compared to the so-called online voting, which you could possibly, if it's well done, even do on an application from home. And of course, paper voting is the most known, so I don't need to explain what that is and also what the challenges with that are. In terms of what are the forms mostly used in Europe, so there is the less used is the online voting. It's mostly used in Estonia, and I don't want to take too much of the time for the first round here, but could say a few more words about this, let's say, exception, which it currently is, but I think there is a future also for the participation of blind, partially sighted voters in the online voting. There are some countries who do the e-voting. We heard also about examples, but there are also many questions when it comes to safety and security issues. Stefan already referred to that, and in some countries they have actually tried it. I know it also from the Belgian case where I used to live. They've tried it, and then they actually said, well, it's not that reliable. They actually went back to the paper vote at some point even. So it's not that, so they're pilots, but it's not used overall. And the paper vote is still today, one could be surprised in the year 23, but it's still quite the dominant majority feature voting method. So regardless of those three, let's say, methods and the advantages and disadvantages they represent, I'd also like to say something about the mostly used by blind and partially sighted, at least according to our observations and our monitoring across the countries. The most used sort of accessibility feature, if you'd like to call it like this, is still actually to go to be assisted by someone in and when casting your vote. Again, there are two ways that are allowed depending on the country. There's sometimes you have at least a choice of who should be your assistant. Most people would then choose a family member, but again, this is a choice at least to have. And in some countries, which is even more problematic, there is actually the rule that the assistant has to be provided by the electoral authorities, so to speak. So you go to a polling station, but you are only allowed to enter individually, because the principle of a vote, it's an individual right, so you're actually not allowed to go there with a family member into when really casting a vote. So someone from the electoral, let's say, authorities who is helping on the election day with, for example, the counting afterwards or so on, will assist you. So that's not actually a free choice of whom you trust with your vote. Both of these assisted voting procedures have raised the general question about the secret of the vote, of course, because even if it's a family member and you've chosen to trust that person, of course, you're still not controlling actually what he or she indicates in the voting ballot. So there is, in any case, still this question. It's not an independent vote in secret still. But still, today, the most used method of, let's say, participation of blind and partially sighted voters across the continent. I'll say one last word, and then we can come back and detail all of those things as well, about, of course, the famous paper voting and what's about Braille voting and how can this help maybe. Because there's, as I said, paper is still the most used feature, and so there are in some countries quite good examples about the providing templates in Braille, which give you the list of candidates or parties and which allow blind and partially sighted people, but when it comes to Braille, mostly blind people, but the same actually would be true for large print versions for partially sighted people, that allow you actually to make your choice really independently and to cast your vote. So there are good examples in that regard. Most of the time those templates are actually provided by either really the state, which is of course responsible for organizing the elections, and most of the time in cooperation with the national or regional disability organization, who then really design the template so that it really allows a blind, partially sighted person to make his, her own choice, depending also on the type of election. So of course you can imagine that having a yes or no, let's say, answer when it comes to a referendum, for example, this is fairly easy to display in a Braille sheet. If it comes to a very complex election process where you have to choose between different lists and even sometimes amongst candidates from various lists, there are some political systems allowing for very complex choices. This is much harder to actually really translate into, let's say, sometimes quite static Braille sheets. So their electronic or online versions would certainly offer more potential to make elections of a complex nature more accessible. Well, I don't want to use more of your time. We can hopefully come back to some of those a bit more in detail, but I think this gives already, hopefully, a bit of an overview of what the general situation is across the continent.